Greetings, everyone, and welcome to today's World Discord podcast. I'm Brian Endless.
I'm Joel Ostro.
Hey, Joel, how you doing today?
I'm all right. Welcome back.
Good.
It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a little while. We took a little break, and now we're getting back into things, hopefully on a regular basis again. And we're starting today with a fun topic. Fun, if nothing, because it's in the news nonstop lately. We have somebody here today to talk to us about tariffs. And I've got a decent idea what tariffs are, but I will tell you that I first personally probably learned about tariffs from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I think a decent amount of the population in the United States did. And strangely enough, I've listened to that monologue again, and it's pretty much perfect. They're actually saying all the right things, and people still have no idea what we're talking about. So I'll let you introduce our guest, and we'll start getting into the basics of tariffs, and then maybe we'll get to some of the complexities too before the show's over.
Thanks, Brian. We are joined by Alex Jaquez. Did I pronounce your name right?
Jaquez, but it's
Alex Jaquez. Apologies. Alex is the Chief of Policy and Advocacy at the Groundwork Collaborative, which is an economic think tank in Washington, D.C. Previously served on the White House National Economic Council under President Biden, and has held positions in the Senate and in the Department of Agriculture in the Obama administration. Alex, I mentioned before we started recording, for the sake of anyone viewing this who doesn't really know what a tariff is, can you give just a baseline definition of what we're talking about here before we get into it?
No problem. So a tariff is essentially just a fee or a tax that is assessed on an import. So that is a good that is made from another country that is brought into the importing country, and the fee is assessed at the border and paid to allow entry. That's all it is, basically. It's a tax on goods that we bring over here for the beginning days of the United States and really around the rest of the world until income taxes and other taxes really became the primary way that countries supported themselves. Tariffs, the revenue collected by tariffs was generally most of the revenue that was collected by a government. And so in the Revolutionary War, post-Revolutionary War period, tariffs were the first major legislative topic that were taken up by Congress because they needed to refill their coffers. And we can go into a little bit more of the history of tariffs, but they're essentially a revenue raiser, a tax on goods or services that are crossing the border.
But then after, or maybe in more the modern times, 20th century, they became a tool of protectionism. Maybe we can get into that in a bit. Brian, you wanted to follow
Let me actually, cut in there because I've just got a quick one to clarify that we don't hear about very often. This tariffs versus income tax. It's come up a little bit in the current debate. My understanding is that back in the beginning of the country, we just weren't able to collect income tax. There was no real good way to do it. Mm-hmm. And tariffs were the easy tax to collect at that point in time because it had to come into a port or some kind of border checkpoint. And it was much easier to get than going out to the farms and taxing everybody on the farms. Is that accurate? Or?
That's right. And, I think another consideration is just, how not widespread yet incomes were, right? In the 1913, the early 1900s, when we started assessing actual taxes on income, it was on a much broader base, a much larger population of higher wages, of course, than there would have been in the early days of America. So it was not only a simpler and more efficient way of collecting taxes at the beginning of the post-revolutionary state. It was also the most effective way of generating revenue. The base was much larger, of course, of imported goods.
One more.
I'm curious. Are there any states that still use tariffs as a primary revenue collector?
So states actually are not able to themselves.
Not U.S. I mean countries.
Oh, countries.
Other countries, yeah.
That is actually a good question. I am not aware of any. I think this is another place where we can kind of discuss tariffs in the context of developmental economics, where you see kind of the American a system that really use tariffs as both a revenue raiser but also a way to protect industry. We've seen that replicated quite a bit across the world, particularly in Asia, as developing economies are beginning to stand up their industrial capacity, but not as much as a kind of sole source of revenue anymore.
Yeah, and the goal since World War II has been to cut them out as much as possible in most places. Let me do
Yeah.
one more quick follow up to your initial discussion, Alex. Here's the question of who pays for tariffs, and I know this can be a very compound, complex question. Let me ask it in two ways: who pays for tariffs directly, and then who might pay for tariffs indirectly?
Uh, that's a good way to get ahead of my answer with the nuance in the second part. Who pays for tariffs directly? The importers. That is who has assessed the fee. They have to pay it. When you are bringing in, if you are a manufacturer who is bringing in a part, if you are a retailer bringing in a good that you are then going to fulfill or resell, you are the one who pays the tariff. The incidence then of who then kind of passes that cost gets passed on to is a combination, right? And we've seen that play out with a little bit more complexity than I think your standard economics textbook or kind of oversimplistic analysis of the situation might be. I think it is widely the case that on a number on large scale tariffs in particular, and on certain goods, of course, companies are going to do as much pass through to the consumer as possible. They want to maintain, above and all, their profit margins, right? And so if they are paying more and consumers are paying the same, you're taking a hit on profit margin, and that's not ideal for obviously your company nor your shareholders. And so they really want someone else to pay for the tariffs. And that is where you see the pass through to consumers in the form of prices. We're seeing that pretty clearly with the kind of large global tariffs that Trump has imposed just recently, post Liberation Day. I think the tariffs on China, although they have been moved down, still far higher than our average weighted tariff rate has been in quite some time. You're seeing an inability, of businesses to absorb the costs, and they are, being much more clear about passing those costs right through. Walmart had an earnings call just yesterday, I believe, or maybe earlier today, where they discussed, they've been trying to eat costs and eat through inventory as much as possible, but prices are going to go up on the shelves at the end of May, by the end of May. So customers are one group who can pay. Suppliers are the other ones who can pay, right? We saw this, I think, in particular in 2018, where importers with large market power, you think of these big buyers, Amazon, Walmart, who have pricing power over their suppliers and the exporters who are selling to them. They really tried to force down those tariff increases onto Chinese firms. And so I think with large success because of their market power, were able to essentially make their suppliers eat their costs. And that means they didn't have to take a bite out of their margins, and they didn't have to pass it along to consumers. The third option, of course, is the company to just kind of eat the tariff in reduced profit margin, and so that's just taking a cut directly out of the company's overall net profit. And so on the most practical level, the importer pays the tariff, and then on a more complex level, there's a number of different end users or middlemen who eventually end up paying more as a result, and that can be suppliers, it could be consumers, or it could be the businesses themselves.
But almost always the cost to consumers is going to go up by some amount. It might not be the entirety of the tariff collected, right?
I think generally that's what we've seen, particularly
Yeah.
with the more significant
Yeah.
increases in tariffs that have been made by the Trump administration, both in 2018 and today. That's generally, the first and best solution for a company if they can get away with it, right? If the consumer is resilient and they don't see it hurting demand for product going forward, ideally for a company, they're going to want to pass those costs through to the customer.
And then can you talk a little bit about um, the shift, like when tariffs became used largely for protectionist purposes? sort of the strategic trade purposes, protectionist purposes?
Yeah. So the point of tariffs was always, they always had some of this, domestic industry protection to them. And this was, particularly explicit in the United States. Alexander Hamilton, they did not cite this in the play whatsoever. It's extremely
Mm-hmm.
disappointing to me as an industrial policy person. But he wrote this treatise, this report on manufacturers,
Yep.
where he said that the United States needed to move from, a small farmer agrarian society to a manufacturer and exporter that could compete globally in the manufacturing sector. And the way he proposed to do so was to, one, provide subsidies for firms that were setting up shop to manufacture in the U.S., to protect those firms until they could reach, the scale and maturity to compete with Britain and the other competitors primarily from Europe, and using tariffs to do so. And so this was adopted by Henry Clay, the American system, with National Bank, use of tariffs to protect domestic industry, and it's really how we shifted really from the colonial days, where we were largely an agrarian economy that imported nearly everything, to a manufacturing powerhouse that emerged from kind of the post-Civil War era, and then of course throughout the industrial 20th century. And so they certainly, tariffs have been reduced globally quite a bit, and in particular
Yeah.
in the post World War II era. We had a run up of trade barriers imposed kind of after the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. Of course, this was the United States raised their tariffs a considerable amount, and then basically every other nation retaliated against us. And President Roosevelt made it a key plank of his platform to essentially be delegated the authority to make trade agreements bilaterally and multilaterally with other countries that would reduce tariff barriers. And he was granted that authority in 1934. And then in the post kind of World War II era, we saw a large liberalization of trade relations with a number of our partners that almost all included dialing back tariffs. And so that has kind of been the dominant measure of, or mode of, trade agreement, thus far. And in the 1970s through the 90s, we made a number of trade deals that all really focus on lowering barriers to trade and lowering tariffs. And so by the time we entered Trump's first term, our kind of average weighted tariff across everything that is coming in was about 2.3%.
Right.
Really, kind of a small tariff if you look at all the goods that we import and all the countries we import from.
I am so glad that you mentioned Hamilton. I use him. I teach a capitalism class. I use him in some other classes. I actually think Report on Manufacturers may be the most important economic book, or one of the most important economic books out there. It's the textbook. It was basically the fight between Hamilton and Jefferson kind of wanted wide open capitalism at the time. But it's the textbook on how to grow as a country. And you mentioned others, but this is one of those, if you're behind everybody else and you don't protect yourself, you are always going to be beholden to other countries. This is the way the United States developed. And now,
Yep.
to a large extent, this is the way we stop smaller countries from developing, because we stop them from doing the same things that we did. So I really think it resonates through history, not just at the founding of this country, but a lot of other countries would love to take that advice, and the current economic system doesn't allow them to do it. That was
There's
my
a wonderful book, a short book, How Asia Works, that
Mm-hmm.
really shows the playbook of how Asian countries have developed, particularly in their manufacturing sectors, which ones went right, which ones went wrong. But you see the through line of every successful,
Yeah.
export and industrialized country, in Asia, essentially follows the same playbook.
And
Yeah.
the U.S. promoted that, right, in the free trade era after the Second World War, sort of encouraged the Asian states to protect those industries that they were subsidizing, developing to eventually produce for exports. But at the same time, wasn't there sort of a consensus that the mercantilist, the competitive trade environment was a factor, a contributing factor to the outbreak, really, of both world wars?
That's right. There's some really good, economic histories. I'm a big Adam Tooze fan, has written extensively about, World War One and World War Two and the economics in particular. World War Two of the German, war
Hmm.
machine and currency, issues and inflation issues and the global trading regime that pressured Germany and the Weimar Republic and really, bred some of the social unrest. You can make the argument these economic factors are persistent throughout, global history. In the United States, of course, the Southern interests and the agrarian interests and slaveholding interests very focused on keeping their, economic model of export led growth in place as well. It's been a factor. Globalization, deglobalization, kind of ebbs and flows throughout history, and kind of nearly every conflict and social unrest.
So maybe we can jump to kind of the beggar thyself policies
Hmm.
of the early 20th century and talk to us a little bit about how tariffs contributed to the Depression. And I've heard a lot of people talking about that as another possibility for the future if we're not careful.
Yeah, so Smoot-Hawley, which is widely regarded as a massive economic misstep by the Hoover administration, it takes place in 1930, and the crash, of course, the market collapse was in 1929. I think there's been some studies that kind of track the legislative ups and downs of Smoot-Hawley and watch the stock market kind of track it even before it was enacted. But what I think is largely consensus, most economists, aside from our current president, is that Smoot-Hawley, and not just the tariff barriers, of course, but the massive retaliation that was incurred by the very aggressive actions on many of our trading partners, certainly contributed to the depths of the Depression. And if you look like I think we would now, as from kind of a Keynesian perspective about the Depression and the massive loss of demand that we were facing, and the aggregate demand shortfall that needed to be filled today, largely would have been by fiscal stimulus. The case for widespread tariffs there makes little sense, right? Increasing the cost of goods that we had fewer workers and lower wages to buy. We were in a deflationary, environment. It obviously, and of course it took the massive kind of fiscal investments of the war machine, beginning to spin up to really get us out of the Depression. But I think the consensus would be that Smoot-Hawley and the kind of massive trade barriers that we enacted deepened and prolonged the suffering, certainly, of the economy and of millions of people during the Depression.
I want to go a little bit more simplistic again and just take it to the questions I've heard people asking and the misunderstandings people have. So, when we're looking at tariffs, you described some of the complexity to it. What we have are prices going up because of these tariffs, because of these taxes. So, we import goods, those goods are going to cost our consumers more. We import steel or aluminum or whatever other products because we're making goods here. Those things are going to cost our consumers more. We export whatever products to other countries. Those goods are going to cost more when they hit the other side because that is the reciprocal tariffs. And then our companies make less money. And overall, we go into this detractionary period. Can you put a little detail on that? I probably went a little bit deeper than I wanted to go, but I kind of want to just get to the basics of it.
Yeah, basically right. I think in 1930, the country, the market was in free fall. The financial crisis had permeated. People were losing, their jobs, and we essentially, raised the costs of everything coming into the U.S. While then, of course, because of these massive reciprocal tariffs, really disadvantaged, our exporters. And if the goal from Smoot and from Hawley, who were two legislators at the time, were to protect our production in the U.S., through the tariff measure, I think it's very clear that failed. And what people needed and what eventually got us out was jobs, and they needed wages, and we needed to put more money into the system. More money trading hands exchanged for goods and services, and that did not really occur until the late 1930s. We had, of course, FDR come in and make several interventions to arrest some of the decline in the financial system. But then, when he tightened up the budget again in the late 30s, we had another recession, and really took until the massive kind of run up to World War II to get us out.
So
When
this is my
I
shocked. Hang on, I have my shocked face on here for a second, Joel. Are you saying that the factories and production aren't going to come back because of these tariffs?
Extremely skeptical, particularly
Yeah.
particularly given, again, I keep talking about kind of the massive investment that went into reindustrializing the U.S. in the late 30s and through the 1940s. That seems to be explicitly what the president does not want to do, right? If you,
Yeah.
again, go back to our handbook, the report on manufacturers, you need incentive and you need to invest in domestic capacity at the same time as you are protecting it. And I think, another thing you need to be, and this is something, I worked in the Biden administration on, is strategic. And there were sectors in particular that we thought, one, were critical to support in the United States. In the clean energy sector, we needed to be able to produce our own, batteries. We did not want to be reliant 95% on one country, China, for all of our production. We saw what happened during the COVID-19 crisis with semiconductors. Geographic dependency on one island, really threw our entire economy for a loop when we shut down our orders from autos and really scrambled that global supply chain. And so resilience and national and economic security is a place where, if you want to invest in domestic capacity, especially when you have a manufacturing competitor, China in this case, who is explicitly, overproducing, producing less than cost, and disadvantaging global producers. That's a place where we stepped in and thought it would be a strategic imperative to protect those sectors. What we did not think is that every single sector across every single country was in the same sort of dire need of protection, or that it was desirable or beneficial to U.S. workers, to make some of these products here in the United States. We currently, produce very little. Baby apparel in the United States. Almost all of it comes from overseas. Our textile wages are simply not as high as our semiconductor and advanced energy wages. And so if we are looking to bring back manufacturing to the US, I think our perspective was that it should be at the upper edge of that technology curve, it should be on globalized industries where we could make advancements and where we could, grow kind of an export-led sector that would persist into the future. And so clean energy, advanced materials, biotechnology, those really were the sectors we were focused on. It seems like the current president does not have much of a focus.
Well, yeah. Can we go back? Just sort of, I think one way to get at the maybe the destructive logic of tariffs. After the Second World War, the United States, emerged with hegemonic power, and at least in the Western world, the non-Soviet bloc, communist bloc world, led the free trade era and the push towards tariffs as close to zero as possible. When I teach my week on IPE in my Intro to International Relations class, I sort of present it as gains of efficiency, which these tariffs are sort of the anti-Doge, and sort of present the example, a country can't produce everything it needs to trade, and to have a different set of trade treaties with every single country requires a whole lot of negotiation and opportunity cost lost. And then at the border, you're going to have different rates on the same goods coming from different places. So the end result is a reduction in trade. you kind of gain economies of scale by having a single broad trade agreement. That's how I explain it. But what were the other benefits of having a global uh, trade regime with a common set of tariffs?
So, the main goal here, particularly for the United States, who was a major producer, was access to markets, right, and the ability to access other markets, and of course, the cost of entry for many of these other countries was entry into the U.S. market, which still is the largest consumer market.
Yeah.
That has been kind of the main economic trade on globalization kind of in the last 30 or 40 years. And I think this is famously called the Washington Consensus. Our political economy also believed for quite a long period of time that the trade liberalization, the ability to intertwine different economies, would also have redound to diplomatic benefits, right?
Yeah.
And we would
Mhm.
create a world in which we were all interconnected and less likely to turn to both economic, but also, of course, violent conflict. This was kind of explicitly, you'll kind of remember the logic of opening trade with China.
Mhm.
One of the stated goals from the Clinton administration, and of course, many of the uh, economists and supporters who believe that China entering kind of the global trading regime would also push it toward democratic liberalization, or kind of draw it down some of their authoritarian tendencies and become more integrated with the West culturally and kind of ideologically as well.
But even before the Washington Consensus, the Western trading order during the Cold War resulted in wild, like unprecedented economic expansion, advancement in um, conditions of living, quality of life, uh, incredible technological innovation. The relief and ease of foreign direct investment helped develop economies, and the program, I think, large like Europe, the European Union is tangible evidence of the success of that. Um, you know, don't have to. Everyone knows, centuries of war between England and France, or France and Germany, interrupted by periods of peace, has been radically changed by as a result of that open trading system, right?
Yeah, I think particularly in Europe, where you have of course, the argument there was a common, market, a common currency. Of course, as we've seen, the EU become would, of course, lead to a this kind of integration and a tendency toward less conflict. Of course, in the kind of immediate Cold War period, the uh, motivation for the United States to emerge, for capitalism to emerge as the dominant economic ideology versus Soviet Union, really tended towards integration with other countries who were
Mm-hmm.
willing to adopt that consensus as well. I will say it seems like we're getting here historically, to maybe some of the downsides of that open global trading regime, and kind of where we have found ourselves. I think Europe being a good example right now, in periods of turmoil between right-wing populism, anti-immigration, anti-EU, anti-continental kind of integration, and here in the United States, where of course we have now elected President Trump twice on a explicit platform of this kind of America first, pro tariff, anti integration, anti globalization ideology.
Yeah, and it's interesting on that of how much of that is actually people concerned about policy
Yeah.
and how much of that is the story that's being told from one side or another. Because I think tariffs, very much like immigration, have a lot more smoke and mirrors than they do reality in voters' minds. Voters, I hope we've got another 5 people listening to this and getting educated about it. But it's amazing how few people have any idea, including people who are are in college and have been through college about how tariffs work and what they might be able to do, and how they contribute to some of the economic issues that we're having. So I see it as kind of compound complex.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I think is tariffs, of course, are, as we kind of discussed from the beginning, are an economic tool with no inherent value or ideological kind of judgment upon them. They're like a tax or a regulation or a subsidy. And then, of course, how you implement and wield them can have consequences that are far flung and far ranging. But I think the idea of quote free trade, and the idea that I think President Trump has really tapped into, an argument that he's made vociferously for decades. The country changes. It used to be Japan, now it's China and Mexico. That someone out there is taking advantage of us, and that the balance of trade is an inherent issue that is disadvantaging the United States. I think that is the part that has rung true. And if you look at particularly in places that were impacted by relocation of auto production to Mexico, or the China shock of the 2000s, you see some of these economic and cultural kind of issues intertwined and hard to unwind from each other, where of course the policy, kind of the textbook trade policy here, is that liberalized trade creates a broad base of winners and a concentrated set of smaller and concentrated set of losers, and that the ideal trade here is to use some of those benefits to compensate the losers. And I think that is what maybe our modern trade liberalization regime, particularly as it pertains to China's entry, has at times forgotten to do, is that compensation.
Brian and I both want to follow up. Can I do the first one and you do the second one?
Yeah.
So, and I think you're right that that's the logic that Trump and the far right are using in pushing these tariffs. But it seems to me that it's like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I see the real problem. Like globalization, I still see the potential and the positive, the benefits for it, of mutual benefit, common development and growth. And it's the Washington consensus, the other aspects of it, that have retarded that potential by fusing our politics with the ultra rich. And that the Stiglitz argument about how to fix globalization in a way that is more commonly beneficial, including beneficial to the middle and lower middle class here. Yeah. Tariffs, I think tariffs won't fix those problems, right? And in fact, I almost see tariffs as making worse the fusion of big money and politics in this country. I don't know if you agree with that, but if you can maybe expound on both sides of that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's tremendous. I mean, a spot on. And I just want to, I guess, be clear up front. I think what President Trump is doing and what we have imposed since, April is, incoherent, economically damaging, and will achieve none of kind of the stated goals here. I think you're absolutely correct, right? I think, you listen to, folks who say the United Auto Workers, for example, who support Donald Trump's 25% tariffs on autos. I think there's a lot of evidence that, that a 25% tariff on autos on their own is, not going to do too much by itself to shift production and move, factories back to the United States. But what they're clear about is that they want, to use this as a stick for negotiating a broader based agreement that benefits. And this is the argument that I think the union will make, benefits not just the workers here in the United States, but the Mexican auto worker, making a couple dollars an hour, making, the same car that is being sold for the same price here in the US. And it's a great, I was with Joe Stiglitz in New York a couple weeks ago on a tax panel. And I think a great reminder of the the benefits of globalization have largely been captured by corporations, by the
Mhm.
wealthy and the middle and lower class, both in the United States, but certainly globally. This is an argument that I find very compelling by Matthew Klein and Michael
Yeah.
Pettis in their book Trade Wars or Class Wars. They look at countries with persistent export surpluses, China being chief among them, but Germany as well. They're able to subsidize that by holding down wages and quality of living for workers, right? And so it is the well-off who are capturing the benefits. It is low-wage workers and mid-wage workers in China and in the United States who are paying the price. And in a
Mhm.
more balanced, and negotiated approach, you could imagine that instead of giving Google protection from IP lawsuits and things overseas being kind of our main trading objective, you could really think about a system that balances trade in a way that benefits all benefits workers in particular and
Yeah.
production.
Just because
Now
it
I,
turned out
now
this
I
way
have two
doesn't mean it had to
follow-ups.
be this way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Now I have two follow-ups. The first is just a quick mention. Stiglitz, fantastic books, and he's got a lot of them. Globalization and its Discontents,
Yep.
since we're mentioning books, I think is an old book that's been updated, but it's still a classic on how
Yeah,
the
the
basics of what's
The
happening.
new one's Making Globalization Work. That's the one I use
Right.
now. Yeah.
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely. Back to though the basic concept. So you said a few minutes ago that this is a question of China, et cetera, taking advantage of us. That's the
Mhm.
language that we're hearing is they're taking advantage of us. And the thing I want to throw out there is this China taking advantage of us? Or is this U.S. corporations choosing to move things to China, to Thailand, to Singapore, to wherever the case might be, because their costs are lower to do the exact same thing there? So, where should we rightly be placing the blame? And then, to some extent, what does tariffs do for that if the problem's not
Yeah.
China personally doing it and it's American companies doing it?
You can call him Friedrich now.
So I think that's a great point, and it's something. When I was at the White House, we thought a lot about the critical minerals supply chain. I won't.
Mhm.
We can spend a whole other podcast on that if you want. But critical minerals. This was they go into everything: smartphones, clean energy, defense systems, lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earths, etc. They are primarily mined and processed in China and in mines in places like the Republic of Congo, where China owns, kind of outright the mines. They made this a key part of their industrial policy to corner the market here. They're able to produce these minerals at much lower costs than the Western world, mines here in the United States and Canada, elsewhere. Because of some key factors. Labor is one of them. Human rights, civil rights, governance, environmental rights. You see the big nickel plants in Indonesia that are polluting the creeks and streams and waters there. You see, of course, the DRC and the child labor violations. There is a you can go and companies and capital has sought the lowest cost jurisdictions, and often that has been over the last 30 years it's been China and Vietnam and Thailand and Mexico. But the reason, or at least one of the reasons that some of these jurisdictions are such lower costs is specifically because of the imbalances that they have on standards. And so you could imagine a trading regime, right, that is based on standards that ensures that you are on a level playing field and really using your comparative advantages and not just kind of pursuing a race to the bottom on wages and benefits and the things I think that we hold dear, at least I do, in terms of production. And so the corporations, to a sense, I used to work for Bernie Sanders, and I worked quite a bit with the business sector. They are going to I understand capitalists, very well. They're going to do, of course, what is going to give them the greatest return and the greatest profits. And so giving them this opportunity to offshore production, to save a dollar, by moving to these other jurisdictions, they're going to take it. And so it is, up to us and policymakers to design systems that prevent that. And if we think that that's a social harm, which I do, it's imperative on us to create a system and mechanisms to protect against that.
So just closing the loop on that, is tariffs one of those systems, or is it completely disassociated?
I don't think it's totally disassociated. Again, it's a tool. Tariffs are a tool. There's a case, I think, you look at our trading laws, many of the sections that pertain to the use of tariffs are defensive, right? They are, I'm thinking of, section 201 where, or section, 232, if you, these are of the Trade Act of 1974. These are, they require investigations by the International Trade Commission to assess whether other producers, exporters in other countries are subsidizing unfairly or dumping excess capacity into the market to disadvantage producers. And in that case, I think an appropriate course of action is to tariff, is to increase the difference between what they are, flooding the market with and are a cost of production. So, they can be a tool in the toolkit, but they are, never on their own. It's simply an inflexible tool. It is a ratchet up in prices. I think there's a number of different, other tools, but agreements being, one of them.
But after the creation of the WTO, tariffs weren't supposed to be that tool. Right? Like, what happened to the WTO? Because wasn't that supposed to be the tool for handling cases of dumping and things that were sort of violation of the broader global trade agreement? Like,
I mean, I think you really saw, post China's ascension, the WTO losing both credibility, both the ability to act, and the ability to act with speed. And that is, I think, a real concern of businesses in the U.S. Who go to, producers in the U.S. Who feel like they have been unfairly, undermined, and then 2 to 3 years after a WTO case is brought, the market has moved on, the factory is closed, kind of, et cetera. I think what we did not contemplate and have not contemplated is the sheer speed and scale that China in particular has brought to the global market, and it's not unique to the United States, right? This is you see Europe raising kind of the same alarms. You see even Brazil and India, extremely concerned that they are next. It's just a spectacular, like an awesome, in the realest sense of the word, scale that we've seen China reach just in this short period of time, being kind of on the global manufacturing scene.
So you didn't quite answer my last question. You answered a more interesting question, frankly. But let me go back to the last one. Have tariffs, or could tariffs be used to incentivize American companies to come back to the U.S. for production if they've moved abroad for cost reasons? Is that likely to work? Do we have examples of that working? Are there more effective things that we could be doing? How could tariffs, or how do tariffs fit in there?
Yeah, so the answer is on its face, yes. You could make it more expensive to produce overseas and force producers that want to stay in business to move closer to home in some cases. I think the question of whether that is desirable in all cases is one we really have to reckon with. And what are the other consequences of raising those costs, on consumers or on the businesses themselves? I think, and of course the scope of retaliation. Again, I think one of the best cases for the use of tariffs as a tool is this infant industry argument, right? And this strategy to protect where you have the disadvantage, right? And you see this in clean energy in the United States. China
that would be really narrow, not across the board, right? Like,
absolutely,
an industry, right?
Absolutely.
Maybe another way to put Brian's question is, it seems like tariffs are a solution in search of a problem. And I think Brian will agree with me that the socioeconomic phenomenon in the United States that brought the rise of MAGA in the far right was the anger and discontent over the grotesque inequality that continues to grow. Um, so, can you maybe speculate on what? Let's assume some high level of across the board tariffs remains under Trump. What will be the impact? One, on inequality, and then two, like, what do you see as the major cascading economic effects,
Yeah.
assuming those hold?
So I think
Yeah, right here and then global.
Yeah. So base case here, so the specifics that Trump has implemented, these kind of massive across the board tariffs, they've been reduced or paused for 90 days. Let's just say we take today's average tariff rate, which is somewhere 20 north of 20%. It's a massive increase from where it was when he took office. Let's say that stays, but 145% on China, these kind of massive reciprocal tariffs don't materialize. What I think you see is increased prices. You see higher inflation. You see lower growth, and you see slower growth, and eventually likely a upward pressure on the unemployment rate, because you are just taking economic activity out of the economy, right? You are slowing consumer spending, businesses. I mean, certainly the uncertainty right now is likely to hit business hiring and investment going forward. And I think really if President Trump really cared about reshoring manufacturing in the U.S., couldn't have picked a worse way to do it. And in particular, because of the implementation of his trade policies, if you are looking to make $1 billion investment in a factory, take that to your board, build it over the next 2 to 3 years, return on investment maybe after 5 years of production. There's no way that you can sign off on that plan if you have no idea what your inputs are going to cost next month or in 90 days, what the tariff policy is going to be next year, whether he's going to change his mind, whether a new administration is going to come in and kind of upend everything. I mean, I really, a freeze on business investment. We're seeing this in the manufacturing surveys. The regional Fed banks kind of take a survey of companies in their area. I mean, that's all the number one word that we're hearing is uncertainty. And so I think you're going to see a real freeze in business investment, a real slowdown in hiring, right? You are just making the economy less dynamic just by introducing all of this uncertainty into it. And then the long-term, impact of this kind of global, this wall of tariffs, which is pretty, forecasted consensus, is going to be there's going to be price pass through because these are too large to absorb just kind of on their own. So higher prices for consumers. And then because, the consumer is less resilient than they were several years ago, less flush with cash, you're starting to even see a little bit of weakness in spending, likely going to see lower consumer spending. It's going to lead to a slowdown in growth in the economy.
Do you see a crash as possible? You're talking to someone nearing retirement, and Brian's got gray hair too.
This is not business advice, but I think the policies are clearly, as they are now, are clearly headwinds on the economy. I think if you asked a couple of weeks ago, certainly if you asked on Liberation Day, if we were going to stick to that large chart that he had rolled out and basically a trade embargo with the second largest economy in the world, I think you could very credibly say that, this was a very recessionary path that we were on. He's backed off quite a bit of it very quickly. And so you kind of still have to wait and see when we're going to start seeing the soft data feed into the hard data. You're starting to see companies saying it'll start to bite, maybe Q2 into Q3. But I think it's still, the chances, I think the blue chip kind of consensus has moved down, but not non-existent, more a coin flip than a certainty now.
So you're talking a little bit more about the domestic side here. What about the international side of the impact? And I'm thinking politics, not economics. It seems like at least two things are going on here. One is that we're adding massive economic instability to other countries. The other is other countries don't know what to make of us because our policy seems to change every 10 minutes. And it's been insanely harsh. And then backing off from that, what do you see as reactions actions of other countries. How important are the political dynamics of what's going on, not just the economic?
Well, I think, for one thing, and this is something that Trump, really set out to do in his first term, but, really shaken the United States as a trusted partner. You cannot, if you are a foreign country, you cannot take, a handshake or the word of the U.S. kind of on its face right now. We've certainly seen, Canada, this became such an issue, the United States politically that, the Liberal Party was able to kind of reverse an almost certain electoral loss on the kind of premise that it would stand up to Donald Trump and to his trade actions. Saw the same thing in Australia. I think for partners who are motivated, genuinely motivated to reach some sort of agreement, there's bafflement. We've seen in particular, Japan kind of walk out of these discussions that they're having with no understanding of what the Trump administration is looking for, of what they can be expected or should be expected to put on the table. And we've seen, the one deal that we've reached so far with the UK is, another kind of baffling one to me. We run a trade surplus with the UK. It should be, if Trump, take him at his word, is obsessed with our trade deficit. It should have been an easy one to take care of. We lowered, duties on Rolls Royces and Bentleys as kind of the big marquee action there, as well as Rolls Royce engines, a different company that we do use and import to put in airplanes, but also kept the 10% global tariff on the UK and made some framework of an agreement for them to buy some of our agricultural products. Very hard to imagine how either one of us are substantively, better off. And if you look at that as the baseline kind of going forward, it's really hard to imagine what outcomes, what the goals are, other than to say, I reached a deal. A lot of countries came to me and said, I need to make a deal. Let's make a deal. And I was able to do that, which I think might be quite a motivating case for the president.
The consequences, I think, will be lasting well beyond Trump too, because if our democracy survives, ultimately it's the American people that put this group in power, and so it's we collectively who've become untrustworthy, which I think is the real political global shock. Which I think will be hard. President Biden and the Biden administration went a long way to try to restore that trust, and if the election had gone differently, the whole world, I think, would look differently now. I don't know if you agree with that, but I think the consequences of this are really long lasting.
Yeah, I think in particular, and the way that coalition was built around Russia's invasion of Ukraine, being able to hold together a coalition of allies there, I think, the goal, I would say our geopolitical goal with regard to China was to encourage and take action kind of collectively in a way to reshape the way that China was impacting the global market. Worked, closely with Canada, with Australia, the EU on a number of these strategic sectors. And I think you can go ahead and throw that one out the window for at least the near term. And you're really, you're seeing you're seeing the EU, you're seeing others start to look at China as the more trusted, partner here. And so it really is, rather than creating, which, you might have been able to do, a block of like-minded countries who could stand up to kind of their economic might. What you're seeing now is just a complete fracturing and a flight, away from the United States.
It's directly backfiring. There's really no doubt about it. All right, Alex, we have one final question for our guests, and it's a kind of silly question. I'm going to put it to you in two different ways, though. You get a magic wand, and you get to wave your magic wand. I'd like to know two things. The first is, if you can use your magic wand, how would you fix the current situation that we're in? And the second is, what would a really good tariff policy look like? And maybe the answer is this.
It's a good question. So I think in terms of, waving a magic wand and kind of rebalancing our kind of global trade objectives, I would want to take seriously again kind of this argument that our the exporting countries, China in particular, is doing so and is able to do so at the expense of their own working class. And I think this is persistent across Germany and China and others. And would want to, build a global framework, right? This is what the WTO ostensibly was supposed to be, but building a global framework that acknowledges that workers have been hurt by the last several decades of globalization, and that there are both in-country and inter-country ways to address that. And so, starting from there, wiping away, if you could wipe kind of our global trading regime clean, and start, towards a new Bretton Woods, right, is something that is often raised, where you have, pretty carefully negotiated global system, not necessarily, but not excluding kind of currency, but on trade that really focuses on boosting incomes and standards of living kind of across the board.
Worker focus instead of GDP.
Yeah, exactly. And what I think a smart tariff policy would look like, again, would be to preserve our ability to protect against unfair and non-market trading practices, and of course to be able to support infant industries if we have technological industries that we need for economic or national security. I think there's quite a bit broken with our own tariff laws and structures. They're not flexible. They are not able to be wielded very effectively or quickly in response to kind of surges. But if we were serious about the ability to protect domestic production in the face of unfair trading practices, you would want to have a tool that is able to level that playing field. Of course, again, this is not a global tool. It is not one to be used in all circumstances, but certainly for that, for an industrial policy, if you believe, as I do, that there are sectors that and there is an inherent good to manufacturing that spills over in productivity and IP and patents and all the rest, that you'd want to be able to protect that industry here at home.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Alex Huckas, thank you so much for joining us. Definitely learned a lot. Tariffs can be a bit of a dry subject. I know my students are really thrilled when we get to the International Political Economy week of my IR class. So thanks for an interesting discussion. Thank you, David, for producing this, and for all of you who are tuning in. Please keep your eye out for future episodes of the World Discord podcast, and spread the word. Thank you.
Thank you all.